want to invite you all to stand for the national anthem. Thank you, everyone. Please keep standing as we call Comrade Ozzy Warwick to lead us in the Union Song.
Thank you very much, Comrade Ian. We are in CLR James Auditorium at Cipriani College. We're in a trade union activity, so let's get some vibes in here. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Let's hear the voices. Forever. And we can sing stronger than that, man. Keep on struggling until we get a better day. We will get a better day. All right, let me do a division. This side. Let me at the stage. As one united movement, everybody. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Our youth will keep on struggling. One line. We will keep on struggling until we get a better day. We will keep on struggling until we get a better day. We will keep on get a better day. Our union makes us strong. Our not the government. Our union makes us strong.
Thank you all so much. Have a seat. We are going to have the safety briefing now. Thank you.
Welcome to the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, CLR James Auditorium. In order to ensure a safe and pleasurable experience, we ask that you listen attentively to the following safety announcement. We are pleased to offer you a smoke-free environment. Patrons are also reminded that eating and drinking are not allowed inside the auditorium. The use of flash photography or any other recording device is strictly prohibited. In an unlikely event of an emergency, we ask that you make your way in an orderly manner to the nearest exit. These are located to the front right of the stage and to the top of the stairs. We ask that you take the time now to identify these exits. Once through these exits, proceed to the nearest muster point, which are situated east of the building on the playing field, or to the front western end of the main building. Once at the muster point, please await further instructions from members of our crisis and emergency team. We thank you for your attention and patience, and do enjoy your stay at the college.
So, for the first time in a long time, I'm actually remembering to introduce myself at the beginning of a program. I am Ian Daniel. I'm the program dean for labor studies here at the Cipriani College, and I will be taking us through our short but important program today. Once again, I want to thank all of you for being here. This is one of the most important issues facing industrial relations practitioners and facing trade unions in Trinidad and Tobago, definitely, but also in the region as a whole. And you will see that we have some regional representation, both who will be speaking to us today and who are present online with us. You cannot understate the importance of this issue. In 2017, after a monumental battle of more than 6 years, nearly 2,000 workers found that after battling one of the most anti-union organizations, one of the most powerful organizations in Trinidad and Tobago, Royal Bank, one of the most powerful banking institutions regionally, that the right to be represented by a trade union that took 6 years just disappeared overnight, evaporated overnight at the hands of a high court judgment, which, if I could summarize it ridiculously small, came down to 2 words: immediately before. It was a tragedy of monumental proportions, in my opinion, and this is the second time that we are addressing the matter and the importance of the matter here at Cipriani College. I want to start by recognizing some of the people here. This is what passes for protocol for me. I want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Edward Lyfolk, who is the Registrar of Trade Unions and who was one of my students not so long ago. I want to recognize the President of IGSW, Robert Benasia. I want to acknowledge one of my earliest students as well, and my most proud student. Yes, it's you, His Honor, Mr. Morton Mitchell, who is also a lecturer here at Cipriani College and one of the powers behind one of our strongest programs. I'd like to acknowledge Mr. Mario Als, the former president of BIGWU and a giant in the landscape of industrial relations. I want to recognize Ms. Vera Guseva and Mr. Shingo Mayaki of the ILO, 2 people that all of us who practice industrial relations will be aware of. Mr. Ozzy Warwick of the OWTU and the GenSec of JTUM needs no introduction. I have serious beard envy where he's concerned. Mr. Trevor Johnson, who is the Assistant Secretary of JTUM and who is a distinguished lecturer attached to the Cipriani College, who is here on stage with us. The President of the CCL, Mr. Andre Lewis, one of my favorite people in the entire region. He is sitting down in the audience. We have Mr. Don Devenish, who is currently the President of BIGWU, on stage with us, a necessary actor in today's play. We have Ms. Elma DeBeek, who is the President of CGWTU, sitting out there, one of my favorite people as well. And Joanne Ogir, President of CWU, who is inside here. There she is. Wonderful. So we have a small crowd, but we have a really good crowd, a heavy-hitting crowd inside here today. Thank you all for being here with us. As we said that in the beginning, we're discussing the impact, the implications of the High Court judgment that has been upheld that removed BIGWU's right to represent represent the workers of the Royal Bank in Trinidad and Tobago. And so just to kick us off, we want to call to the mic the president of BIGWU, the union involved, Mr. Don Devenish, to give us a little bit of background and context for this discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now, briefly, when the union was formed back in 1974, the process of obtaining recognition was about 3 months. And as the years go by, you find it move from 3 months to a year, then 3 years, and now you see the results that be happening. The process that they engage in terms of what our legislation has is really to frustrate the unions. It's really to prevent unions from expanding. When you read that judgment that has been given with respect to the RRCB, then you will come to realize and understand that that piece of legislation that we have that governs the recognition of a union in a workplace is not meant to encourage trade unionism in the workplace. It is meant to discourage it. It is meant for a union not to expand. Now, for instance, when I mean not to expand, you have trade unions that represent a number of workers in companies. That is expansion. But the thing is, the powers that be don't want that. Do you think they want OWTU to be in 158 places, the majority in Trinidad and Tobago? They wouldn't want something like that. So these pieces of things are meant to frustrate the process. For instance, you have to determine the bargaining unit, and then they will look and see whether a supervisor is appropriate to be in this bargaining unit or not. But the supervisor is a worker. What that has to do with the union obtaining recognition in our workplace? The union should be free to obtain. The democratic process should be there, and that is what we talk about democracy. Democracy is about the people deciding on things. And if the majority persons decide that, listen, they want banking, insurance, and general workers to represent them in this workplace, then why should we encounter such obstacles in our way? We shouldn't be, because then there is no democracy really. They are saying that, oh, you have to look at your books. What do you want to see my books for? That has nothing to do with the union representing persons, with persons coming in and joining the union, taking recognition. But that is the kind of processes that we have here. And what has to take place and what the solution for this is simple. It's not a complex thing. How it is, you just look at the other islands that we have. Do their process take so long? And we could take from that. That is what we don't have to go and reinvent the wheel. Use their examples, use their experience, and bring it in. And you will find that the process in Trinidad and Tobago will change. For that to change, we have to have the strength. The trade union movement must have the strength to stand up and demand of the government of the day to bring in the pieces of legislation, or we demand that a parliamentarian bring in the piece of legislation and push for the government, push for those parliamentarians to amend the laws to allow trade unions to have recognition in the simplest way. Yes? So that is my little piece. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade President. As President Don Devenish pointed out, central to this discussion, the discussion of recognition, is the issue of the strength of the trade union movement, the strength of the individual trade union, and the strength of the movement as a whole. There's no way that we can hide from the truth. The truth is that union membership, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but worldwide, has been decreasing, in some cases meteorically, and for quite a while now. Recognition, registration is part of the process of strengthening. And if we are unable to do that, then the strength that Devenish is talking about that is necessary to fight issues like this just doesn't exist. I remember standing here one day in a full auditorium, and a young man stood at the furthest seat in the back and asked me, what's the point of trade unionism? You know, we needed Ozzy here to be leading a Solidarity Forever to start to answer that question. But in another place, I sit on the RRCB, and I've seen the difficulties of recognition firsthand, processes that take years. I see another member of the RRCB and of OWTU just joining us here this evening. We know that the process is a difficult one, and this judgment has made that even more difficult. The joint trade union movement has had several meetings discussing the impact and implications of this judgment. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Trevor Johnson, the Assistant General Secretary of JTUM, to come and give us the benefit of their deliberations on this judgment, and it's important.
Thank you very much, Comrade Ian and other colleagues on stage, and of course, my fellow colleagues who have taken the time to be here with us this evening. And I just want to emphasize that even though this is a relatively small gathering, this could turn out very well to be a historic gathering, out of which we hope we would see the significant change that is required for us. We have to be able to act. When we are challenged with something that, like we have heard from Comrade Devenish of BIGWU, and we know that there's a judgment against BIGWU, and I want you all to be aware of that. This judgment from the High Court, Justice Margaret Mohammed, which came out on I think it was the 14th of December, 2017. Right, so that judgment you can always look at in terms of it. The judgment is our Royal Bank versus the Recognition Board of Trinidad and Tobago, and with BIGWU, Banking, Insurance, and General Workers Union joined as an interested party, because Royal Bank really challenged the process by which the Recognition Board would have gone about the whole recognition procedure for somewhat a 30-40-year period that the Recognition Board has been using this process. Trade unions, all of us here who are trade unionists and practitioners who go before the board, organizing officers, etc., are familiar with the procedure. So that is the procedure by which trade unions would have been granted recognition. You would have organized workers, been granted recognition. You'd have taken your application before the RRCB, and they would have gone through a process of deliberation, and then they would have granted a recognition certificate, or given the union recognized majority or RMU status for a particular group of workers. And this is how we have operated throughout all the unions who are here. This is how you have been able to organize your members over the years. So this judgment by the High Court in 2017 effectively quashed, and if you read the judgment, it actually uses the term that the certificate granted by the Recognition Board to the Banking, Insurance, and General Workers Union was quashed. That's the term that the judgment uses. It also indicated that just a quick summary, that all the deliberations or the decisions of the Recognition Board relative to that matter was also quashed. It's on the last page of the judgment when you get to it, where it summarizes the judge's orders as a result of that. And further, as a result of that, both the Recognition Board and BIGWU was also ordered to pay costs, right? This is against a multinational, multi-million or billionaire bank. These two agencies, one a state agency and one a trade union, was ordered to pay the cost of Royal Bank bringing this challenge against the Recognition Board, and the union. The recognition board would have appealed this judgment, and it would have gone to the appeal court of Trinidad and Tobago. And on December 14th, 2022, the appeal court, I think the quorum was headed by Justice Nolan, upheld the decision of the lower court, the High Court, effectively agreeing with the High Court that the process being used by the recognition board was flawed, that the process that unions followed as a consequence was flawed, and therefore basically they upheld that appeal, or rather, the appeal, dismissed the appeal, rather, I should say, by the recognition board. So basically, what we've seen as a result of that right now is that all applications before the recognition board by trade unions are in a state of just halt, because nothing can really go on. But what the court has effectively said is that recognition board, your procedure being used over the years is flawed. You need to come up with a new procedure. So any trade union with an application before the board, or any union seeking to make an application before the board using what we would call the existing procedure, that is likely will fail, because the court has just effectively said that procedure is flawed. We would have had some I would say informal discussions with senior counsel, that's the joint trade union movement, just to get a perspective. It wasn't so much a formal opinion being sought at that time, but seeking to get a perspective from senior counsel as to what are the implications of this judgment for the trade union movement, because this is not just about BIGWU, though we acknowledge that the judgment was against BIGWU, but effectively, by handing down that judgment, all trade unions in Trinidad and Tobago have been negatively impacted. And one of the things that was indicated is that this judgment basically will affect the way trade unions recruit new members and apply for recognition now and in the future. So this was just a couple of months ago, the JTUM meeting with getting a perspective from senior counsel to just to get an idea as to where we are with this. And senior counsel went on to say that the practice being followed at present does not fully align with what was intended by the IRA. He also indicated that the role of the union organizer, that's usually within each union, you may have someone called an organizer, or the person responsible for organizing and going to the recognition board. Their role would change, because he says that the process trade unions followed for several decades will now have to be looked at, because the focus of this judgment, or the crux of it, was on the accounting system used by unions, which allows a prospective member to pay a particular whatever the sum their dues is, and that is held not deposited until we get the requisite 50 plus 1%. And that, as a result of this judgment, this is what the court has indicated, that this basically has to change. And what my colleague Comrade Don was indicating, we are already in a situation in the Caribbean. We are unique, because in just about every other jurisdiction in the Caribbean, recognition process takes from maybe a few weeks to maybe at max 6 months. The average is about 3 months for a union from the time they apply for recognition and that they are granted the requisite approval. In each territory may vary, of course, the process may vary a bit, but largely speaking, it's premised upon the trade union making an application to an authority, and that authority granting recognition to the group of workers. And what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago is, as Comrade Don indicated, starting with a few months, and now it takes as much as could be 5 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years for us to be granted recognition. that could never be justice for any group of workers who are seeking to have their, to be granted recognition, for a trade union to be able to represent them in the workplace, for them to be able to engage in collective bargaining, right? At conventions 87 and 98 of the ILO, we know very well, which is what workers are seeking. So the senior counsel advised that basically, what are the implications of this? It means that as we stand at present, if any union tries to use the current or the procedure to go before the recognition board, that is likely or more than likely to fail. What has to happen is that the recognition board, if it follows the judgment of the court, has to come up with a new practice note, which will guide unions, but that has to be subject to some sort of tripartite agreement, because the recognition board is a tripartite body. Unions, labor representatives, business, and of course some representatives of the state or government. So that process, we are hoping they should have started already, but we are not hearing at present from the recognition board as to exactly where they are with that process. The other significant item the council advisors was that what is really required in Trinidad and Tobago now is for the labor movement to get together to lobby the government of Trinidad and Tobago for legislative amendments to simplify the recognition process as occurs in all other territories throughout the Caribbean. The recognition process in Trinidad and Tobago, we always say sometimes, is like ADMATS, very convoluted. It's supposed to be a simple process. Workers indicate we want trade union X or trade union Y to represent us. The majority of us feel that this is the trade union we want to represent us, whatever simple count you do, and the recognition process is the certificate is granted, given that trade union the right to represent that particular group of workers. That's a process that should take a few weeks, just like when a company applies to the Registrar General, they want to form a company, they want to start a business. No trade union challenges any company because they want to start a business. So why in heaven's name is a company being able to come and say to the recognition board, we object to this group of workers being represented by a particular trade union. We are not getting in the business of whatever companies want to do. So our question is simply, why are they invading, and why is the law and why is the state allowing big business to interfere with the process of workers being able to simply pursue their goal of having trade union recognition? That is their right. That is a human right. Trade union rights are human rights, and that's a violation of the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. And we are just saying that has to stop now, but it requires action on collective action. This is no longer a BIGWU issue. With all due respect to BIGWU, and they have a challenge, but this is no longer a BIGWU issue. This is no longer just a trade union issue. This is about the rights of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And we need to understand that we must not allow any multinational anti-union bank like Royal Bank, like Scotia Bank, because I'm calling them out because those are some of the institutions that are coming to Trinidad and Tobago and saying to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, we do not want your workers to have the right to be represented by a union of their choice. So I don't know why the government is simply sitting back and allowing this, but that is what is happening. We are allowing multinational companies to come into Trinidad and Tobago and say, we are bringing business, we are bringing work, so we don't want any problems with trade unions. But that is not acceptable. That is a violation of so many ILO conventions that we can think of. And we are saying to the government of Trinidad and Tobago that we want the necessary legislative amendment to be effected right now. That's what we are saying. So I just wanted to basically those are some of the key takeaways from the consultation with senior counsel in terms of having a conversation. I know some unions were concerned about whether the existing certificates that were granted prior, whether those were under threat. Based on the advice given by senior counsel, he has indicated those cannot be, because the employers for those would have had to bring judicial review action within a set time frame. So where you have already existing certificates, those are protected, but the challenge will be that any applications before the recognition board at this time, and any application any trade union will consider putting before the board, those are the ones that are threat. So essentially it means you cannot, wherever you are organizing members, we're going to have a challenge until this process is sorted out. And this is what we are seeking: urgent action, and also the collective action of all trade unions with the support of workers in Trinidad and Tobago. Even if you are already unionized, this is still a threat to you, and everybody within our trade union should take this seriously. So I will just stop there and hand back over to Comrade Ian Daniel.
Thank you very much, Trevor. If you are accustomed to Trevor, you know that Trevor has one speed, down tempo. It's always interesting to see him get going on the mic when he gets really involved like this. In another life, a long time ago, when some of these good gentlemen here were actually my trade union representatives while I was working in Republic Bank, my brother was working at Royal Bank at the same time. So it was a really interesting comparative study. My salary was better. My pension benefits, all of my benefits were better. At 4:30, Republic Bank ran me out of the building so as to not have to pay me overtime. With the big stick, the security put you out. My brother couldn't leave Royal Bank until 5:30, 6 o'clock, and there was no overtime involved. My brother, on numerous occasions, literally described working at Royal Bank as being on the plantation. This is this is the reality of what we're talking about here today. And as Trevor is pointing out, this situation is a situation that looks at rights of the workers versus procedures. I just want to say on behalf of some of the people of the RRCB inside here right now, without telling tales, that it always comes up how the procedure that we are engaging in is curtailing the rights of workers. How can we find a better way to defend the rights of workers? And even the business representatives on the RRCB are cognizant of these issues. But still, we are left with the letter of the law versus social justice and the international responsibility of employers in Trinidad and Tobago. We are signatories to the ILO Convention 98 with the right to organize and the right to collective bargaining. If you are not recognized, you cannot enter into collective bargaining. It is this simple. And so I want to bring to the mic my good comrade, Mr. Akins Vidale, who will talk about the differences in the systems of recognition throughout the region and give us some suggestions as to how we could improve the situation in Trinidad and Tobago. Akins.
That was unnecessary. Yeah? Good afternoon, comrades. So I want to, I know Ian had recognized a few persons, so I just want to recognize, I think I saw Eddie Stewart, president of TTRNA, joining us as well. Good comrade and friend, Amelka senator and former president of the Guild. Now I think just former president of the Guild. We leave it right there. Right. So I have an interesting task, and I'm going to try to do this in 10 minutes, which is, we'll see how it goes. Right. So I'm going to try to deal with the recognition and registration recognition process. But what I want to do is I want to contextualize it. You see, one of the things now as a historian, that's where I like to start from the beginning. And one of the things that we have a problem with is that we don't understand context for things. So when Comrade finished correctly, when he asks why, that is what I'm going to try to address quickly. The why. Why is the legislation set up the way that it is? Because if we understand why the legislation is set up the way that it is, then we can begin to formulate a strategy to treat with the legislation. But if we don't understand the why, then we'll be kind of dealing with the peripheral things all the time, or the symptoms of the problem rather than addressing the problem at its core. Yeah, and that's what we want to do. And I want to make the point as well. Yesterday, I was in front of a different crowd. So I'm accidentally invited, I think, to speak to AmCham on energy transitions yesterday. So I'm speaking to a business community only. They are very well organized. They are trying to come to consensus positions on how to deal with transition to renewable energy as a collective. While at the same time, in this same space, there's an effort to have workers move from collective action to operating as individuals. Understand the transition coming to us with workers unorganized as individuals up against the private sector and government in Trinidad and Tobago. And then trying to contemplate and carve out a space for ourselves in this environment. It's also interesting that I think on 3 occasions I had to say, at the risk of losing my job, but I think today might be worse. We'll see. So next slide, objectives, right. So quickly, as I said, I want to trace the development of legislation. I think that is important. We will do a comparison. I just want to do Grenada. Well, yes, President CCL from Grenada is here with us, but I think there's a very important thing that Grenada has that we don't. I want to look at the ILO report on our contravention of the conventions, which is also critical. And I want to make a few recommendations to the movement here. So I want to start with trade unionism denied. All right, next slide. This is 1832, right? So we know that time, right? This is pre-emancipation. And Lord Howick, who is the Secretary of State for the colonies, says the great problem to be solved in drawing up any plan for emancipation of the enslaved in our colonies is to devise some mode of inducing them, when relieved of the fear of the driver and whip, to undergo the regular and continuous labor which is indispensable in carrying on the production of sugar. So immediately the thinking is workers need to stay on the plantation. That is the fundamental principle. Next slide. Right, as I said, forgive me, I'm going to move a little quickly. What does that lead to? That leads to 2 things. The apprenticeship scheme, which keeps workers on the plantation after emancipation for another 4 years, using regulations to keep them there. So slavery is abolished, but they implement regulations to keep them on the plantations where they can't leave. Because of protest action and continuous rejection of that system, the system which is supposed to last 6 years lasts only 4. And in 1838, emancipation is recognized. And I want to say again, legal emancipation. Full emancipation is something else. All right? So legal emancipation is recognized. What they then do, 1838, between 1838 and 1840, throughout the region, a suite of legislation is introduced called the combination laws, which prevent workers from organizing into trade unions. All right, which prevent. So that's the first labor legislation that we have in the region is actually anti-trade union legislation, preventing you from forming a trade union. And I just want to read the last part there where it says the rationale, where it gives the rationale. And I want you to keep that in mind because it is going to appear again later on, that rationale. It says it sees trade unions as injurious to trade and commerce, dangerous to the tranquility of the country, and is especially prejudicial to the interests of all who are concerned in them. In other words, trade unionism is now seen as a threat to national security. In other words, trade unionism is seen as a political activity. And we will find, when you look at the historical engagement of trade unionism and labor organization in the Caribbean, it is addressed from a political point of view. It is not addressed from an industrial relation point of view. It is addressed as a political matter, so that all the responses of the state to action by workers was always met with a political response. And of course, the contradiction is that they then tell the trade unions not to get involved in politics. All right. Next slide. William Burnley, one of the biggest plantation owners in the country at the point in time. I think Selwyn Kudrow wrote a book on him maybe about 10 years ago, I think it is already. He was the chairman of the Agricultural Society. He was an executive, he was on the executive council at the time, and he was one of the largest landholders in the country, as I said, owning the Orange Grove estate in Tacarigua. Yeah. So his position was, so long as there is not labor sufficient to enable a proprietor to cultivate all the land he holds, a portion of it will be valueless. Right? And then he goes on to say that, well, then he'll sell it off for small money and the formerly enslaved could buy it and they will work on that land and then they would need to come by you to work again. Right? I'm paraphrasing what he says in that. And then he goes on to say that we need to introduce quickly a sufficient number of laborers so as to create wholesome competition among wage laborers, reduce their wages to a fair rate, and check idleness, vagrancy, and other bad habits. This is in 1838. And we're already talking about reducing wages. Comrades, there's no time that I've read where employers have said there's a good time to increase wages. Right? I've not read that anywhere. But I've read on multiple occasions where there were clear efforts to stymie any discussion on increasing wages and increasing or improving terms and conditions of work, which is what, comrades, that's collective bargaining. So even though it's not called that, we have to see where there are structures being put in place to interfere with a collective bargaining process being developed in the colonies after emancipation. Next slide. Early labor law. Now, this one is interesting. The Masters and Servants Ordinance of 1846, yes, named masters and servants, which gives you a clear sense of the relationship it defines between worker and employer. Anybody wants to take a guess when this piece of legislation was repealed in Trinidad and Tobago? This legislation was repealed in 2012. We had the Master and Servants Ordinance in our books until 2012. There was one major amendment to this legislation in 1838, and this was due to in no small part, to the work of the ILO. The sanctions for breaching contract by the employee was jail. All industrial relations sanctions were jail time. So in other words, they criminalized industrial action. That is what we were dealing with. Industrial action was criminalized. So anytime you broke any part of your contract, and guess who determines if you broke your contract? The employer. Guess who determines what the infraction was? The employer. Guess who determines what your sentence was? Yeah? This is what we're dealing with. This is 1846. Then 1899, there's some amendments made to the Immigration Ordinance, which reinforces what had been a practice, but now puts it in law to ensure that the East Indian population who are in the country, are also not allowed to organize, also not allowed to be part of the working class movement, also not allowed to engage in industrial action for fear of imprisonment. Those are the facts of the matter, comrades. So that in 1899, I don't know if we're thinking about that date. On Monday, when we celebrated May Day, we said, well, it's 100 years of celebrating it in Trinidad and Tobago. But persons spoke to the fact, I think it was Comrade Benasia, I can't remember who else spoke about the 1886, the genesis of May Day. So in 1886, you have workers creating a condition which we celebrate. And in 1899, we're going in the wrong and in the opposite direction. That's our reality. One would hope that something as important as independence would change that, right? Next slide, please. There's some interesting faux pas that take place throughout our history where government officials, through some moment of, I don't know, lapse of judgment or maybe benevolence, they call out the system for what it is. All right? And we have several examples of that. So Henry Alcazar, who's the mayor of Port of Spain during this period, says in his submission to the West India Commission of 1898, which submission I think he would have actually made in 1899, he says, I'm justified there in contending that fall of wages in Trinidad and Tobago is not to unavoidable economic causes, but to the operation of a system which places absolute command of the labor market in the hands of the employers. That statement could be made yesterday. That is the problem. All right, where market forces are really employer boardrooms. That's what we're dealing with. There's no international arbitrary market force dictating and determining anything in Trinidad and Tobago. It is employer boardrooms as determining all of this. Next slide, please. So this labor policy, or the approach to labor up to 1937, had three primary outcomes. One, it ensured a cheap and continuous supply of labor for a weakened plantation economic system. That was the first thing. The second thing is that it treated labor disputes as criminal matters, further reinforcing inferior social positions of the laboring masses. Now, let's not forget that. These are persons who have come out of slavery, come out of indentureship, who by the design of the society are the lower rungs, and then you introduce legislation which criminalizes any action they take to put themselves out of that bottom rung. So you reinforce their status within the society. Finally, what this legislative framework does prior to 1937 is it reinforces the position of the worker in the pre-emancipation period. It reinforces the attitude towards workers. And comrades, there's a lot of literature you could read about what employers thought about workers in this period and how they dealt with them. All right, this is not, it's not secret. And this is the interesting thing. This is not a secret. This is not hidden. This is not any clandestine thing that I uncovered through weeks and months in the archives. All right, this is there first. This is there first. Next slide, please. All right, not too bad on time as yet. So international forces come together. And what happens with us in the Caribbean is that there's actually a change in the government in Britain. And so the UK Parliament, which is once controlled by the Conservatives, is now actually controlled by the Labour Party. And so the Labour Party takes a position, now they're Fabian socialists, so they're not exactly radical, but they take a position nonetheless that the Commonwealth, the colonies ought to have some kind of labor organization. And through the Pacifield Bill, paper, sorry, you have the introduction of trade union ordinances throughout the region between, throughout the colonies between, anywhere between 1930 and 1933. So we in the Caribbean end up with a trade union ordinance in 1932. Prior to that, trade unions had to register either, or workers' organizations had to register either under the Companies Act or register as a friendly society. And the reason for that is that you're collecting money and there needed to be some kind of oversight. So the Trinidad Working Men's Association was actually registered as a company. And that is how it performed its function. Now, one of the interesting things is that when this piece of legislation is passed, and we won't get into Cipriani necessarily, and Cipriani changes the name to the Labour Party and refuses to register as a trade union, it was not just a matter of him deciding not to register. What the trade union ordinance did when it came into force is that it nullified or declared null and void all workers' organizations which were previously registered either under the Companies Act or as under friendly societies. So it declared all of those organizations null and void, and therefore, at the point when this registration came into being, it was not just that he had to make a choice of whether to register the TWA or not. Well, let me put it the other way. He had no choice because the TWA ceased to exist as a registered, recognized organization once this piece of legislation came into being. What are the deficiencies in this legislation? Legislation makes no provision for collective bargaining. There's no right to strike, which interestingly enough, we still have. All right, so again, where do things come from? All right, and you know, the denial of the right to strike here comes from 1838, reinforced in 1920 with the Strikes and Lockout Ordinance. All right, and then you come to 1932, and it is reinforced here. No protection from liability and tort. In other words, when the trade union goes on strike, you cause the company to lose money. All right, production ceases, maintenance of machinery stops, and therefore there's some kind of cost that the company incurs. There's no protection from that in this legislation. No funds to be contributed to any political entity of any kind unless you set up a separate fund exclusively for that. And I said no space for collective bargaining, but an interesting one is that the recognition is still voluntary. In other words, so OWTU, for example, goes into, and I think the politics of the situation put the company in a position where they had no choice but to acknowledge that the Oilfield Workers Trade Union was the recognized union. But by law, they were actually not obligated to recognize the Oilfield Workers Trade Union. And I make that point because when you're dealing with, I think this is one of the law swap moments, right? When you're dealing with trade union activity, there's the industrial relations component and there's the political component of it. Yeah, so if you understand when to maneuver between both, you can increase your win percentage significantly. Yeah, okay, it's all right. I was unemployed before. I'll survive. Well, I have, which is, yeah. Well, actually, no, we don't. No, we don't. No, we don't. Right. Yeah, that's for another forum. Right. So up to 1938, after the establishment of the trade union ordinance, only 11 organizations actually registered using this legislation. This is how debilitating the legislation was, that trade unions literally refused to engage in it. All right, next one. Next slide. All right, so national anthem, raise your own flag, things nice. We should be moving forward, ever backward, never, right? Well, so in 1965, and I suggest every trade unionist needs to read Dr. Williams's full speech in his presentation of the ISA to the Parliament. If you're a serious trade unionist, read the entire presentation to understand the framework for labor relations in Trinidad and Tobago. So I'll give you a small piece. And he says, government necessarily has to, and he said something I'm saying itself, with the larger question of national security. Where does that come from? Go back to the combination laws, where industrial action is seen as a national security issue. This is what we did in 1965. When the ISA was introduced, a state of emergency was called for the ISA to be passed. That meant that even as trade unions had restrictions on strikes, they could not. But what was happening at the time is that the promise of what independence ought to have been was exposed. And in 1961, 62, 63, right? Again, in his presentation as well, he identifies how many man hours are lost, how many work days are lost, because it is strike after strike after strike after strike. Because the unions are co-opted into an arrangement to recognize the People's National Movement as a party to take them into independence. All right? And the history tells us exactly how the workers felt about that. It's not I say so, it's not Akins, Vidale say so, This is historical fact. This is what is there. All right? He goes on to say, the government must differentiate between legitimate trade union activities. And again, this is something the comrade asks here. Who decides that? Who decides what is legitimate trade union activity from not legitimate trade union activity? Legitimate trade union activity or other activities which threaten the security of the country. And so the ISA is introduced as a piece of legislation to restrict the objectives, to restrict the mobilization, and to restrict the organization of workers. All right? Next slide. Very often we talk about the ISA, and I think the ISA is beaten about badly. Many of us are also aware that the Civil Service Act is also Civil Service Act of 1965. So in 1965, suddenly now we have civil and public servants. So my comrades who are here from the Ministry of Labor, I welcome you because this part is for you. All right? All civil and public servants, with the introduction of the Civil Service Act, are removed from the definition of worker. All public and civil servants removed from the definition of worker. And are then given their own individual acts to instruct what the relationship between them and the state is. So you end up with the Police Service Act, I think it is 28, Fire Service 29, Prison Service 30, Education Act 31. So they don't just go civil service, Teachers pass in this too. Why? Because if you stop the education system and people's children have to be taken care of, you could shut down the country very easily. And so you want to manage what is happening in your schools as well. This is not and this is something that came up yesterday when we were talking about transitions. We could transition how much we want. If we don't change the approach to development and our general approach to how we do developmental policy, we will just transition into the same thing. And nothing will change for workers like us. And so we're seeing here that the policy objective has not changed or had not changed from the pre-1937 position. This is an interesting thing though. So the ISA, for everything that it was, actually had time restrictions for recognition of a union. So the ISA suggested that within 7 days, the employer must come back and say whether they accept or reject the union's application for recognition. 7 days, as opposed to 7 years. Now, the employer had a right to reject, and they could reject on several grounds, which include definition of a worker and worker in good standing. Sound familiar? Those are the grounds that I introduced there, that they could reject on those grounds. 7 days, if it is rejected, the union could forward its issue to the Minister of Labor, and the Minister of Labor could intervene, but there's still no mandate for the employer to accept the minister's intervention, which is interesting. All right. Another thing that I want to outline here has to do with the Disputes Resolutions Act, which is, well, Ordinance 3943, right? Trades dispute 43. And in the trades dispute, which sets up the framework for collective bargaining, one of the interesting things is that originally, all persons who were witnesses before the tribunal could be asked to bring evidence. There's an amendment made where if the evidence you are bringing is self-incriminatory, you could decline to bring the evidence. Guess who asked for that? The employer. So now, and Comrade asked about seeing books and all sorts of things. The employer can ask to see the books of the union and see who is a member in good standing or not, but the union cannot equally ask to see the books of the company to see whether or not the company could pay the wage that the union is asking for. Because the company is not obligated to present any evidence, whereas the worker is obligated to present evidence. Now, I don't know, but something scale seems a little off there to me, all right? Next slide. 1972, IRA. And I want to commend the Oilfield Workers Trade Union here. And I think it is something that we miss in our discussions. Even as George Weeks and Joe Young stood alone in fighting the ISA, the Oilfield Workers Trade Union continued to recognize the IRA as being a minimal improvement on the ISA. A minimal improvement. And I think when we talk about the legislation, we miss that point a lot, that the IRA is not a significant improvement on the ISA. It really isn't. So remember in IRA and ISA, we had dates. Well, next, and sorry, before you go to the next slide, that last part there. And the wording is so interesting. Recognition of a trade union by an employer. All right, next slide. This is the only part of the section of the RRCB that speaks to time and doesn't speak to time at the same time. So it says the board, this is the RRCB, shall determine the periods that are necessary for the fair and adequate presentation of the matter by respective parties thereto. That's it. That's the only time the legislation speaks to a time frame for recognition. It's up to the board to decide. Now, challenge with that is that the board has obligations and the board can find itself subjected to inquiries from the employer. Inquiries about the 50% mark, whether the union has said the 50% mark or not, and Comrade raised that point. And then how is it dealt with? Well, you just make somebody a supervisor and then they're not a worker under the act anymore. Right? Or you spend so much time questioning worker in good standing. So the workers over 6 years are expected to pay dues for no representation. What's going to happen? Eventually some workers are not going to pay those dues again. and you lose 50%. Those things are deliberate to frustrate you. All right. My question is really, and Comrade made the point, there are 3 entities that should be involved in a trade union being recognized. 1, the workers. 2, the union willing to recognize them. And 3, or represent them, sorry. And 3, the statutory body established to stamp officially the recognition. Full stop. All right. There is no place in recognition for the employer. And even in our basic right to association under the Constitution, you really ought to be allowed as a worker to say, I want this union to represent me, full stop, that's it. The employer doesn't have a say in that. Right. Just 2 quick regional comparisons. 1, Grenada. We need a constitution. Except with his own consent, no person shall be hindered in the enjoyment of his freedom of assembly and association. That is to say, his right to assemble freely and associate with other persons, and in particular, to form or belong to trade unions or other associations for the protection of his interests. Trade union representation is protected in the Constitution of Grenada. Comrades, we have to get them around for that. Yeah? That is we all have, all the rest of us have freedom of association. But freedom of association as predetermined by if the AG lets you do it. All right? And the recognition process, trade union claiming to have as members in good standing a majority of the employees of an employer in a bargaining unit may, subject to the provisions of this part, make application to the minister to be certified as the exclusive bargaining agent of the employees in the unit. Within 14 days of receipt of an application under Section 33, the minister shall either refuse or institute a poll of the unit specified. Within 14 days. Trinidad ain't far from here. Guyana. All right, and I'll send it so you all can see here. All right. The last line says, the board has 2 months after receiving the application to determine same with specific guidelines stated in Section 19 of the Act. All right, this is the Trade Union Recognition Act of 33, number 33 of 97, the law that guides Guyanese practice. 2 months to make a determination, clear in the legislation. Ours is a reasonable period of time. That's what we have, a reasonable period of time. And well, you know, in Trinidad and Tobago, reasonable could mean anything at all, right? The question is always reasonable to whom? All right, reasonable to whom? I want to make another point here about the politics of the situation. And for us to understand why Trinidad and Tobago is treated as roughly as we are. And it is our curse, which is oil. All right, and this is a point that Ian and I talk about a lot. In 1939, with the breakout of the Second World War, Butler is imprisoned just in case. Butler is put into prison just in case. All right, he had no warrant outstanding at the time. He was just a potential threat to our supply of oil to the British Empire during a time of war. Trinidad and Tobago at this time supplied the empire with 25% of its oil. Understand that, Matt? Little Trinidad and Tobago supplied the British Empire with 25% of its oil. And they guarded that fiercely. And so Butler, a potential threat to the supply of oil during a time of war, is imprisoned for a couple of years to just sit and think about how he's behaving in the public. Yeah, this is what we did. This is what was done. Yeah? Okay. Now I turn to ILO conventions. So, next slide. I have to see. Not bad. I told you I'd behave. I'd be disciplined. All right. In its previous, so Articles 2, 3, and 4 of the convention, and here you're talking about 87. Yes. In its previous comments, the committee, and this is the committee of experts, had requested the government to take the necessary measures to amend Section 10, 18, and 18(1) of the Trade Union Act relating to trade union registration and cancellation thereof, right? As well as Section 16 and 33 of the Trade Union Act concerning financial supervision of trade unions and the administration of their funds, so as to bring these sections into full conformity with the convention. So, comrade, it's not just miserable people like myself and Ozzy and Comrade Debik and whoever else, some of the other comrades here, Joanne and so on, who are saying to us that there are issues with the IRA or the Trade Union Act or the way in which trade unions are regulated here. And this is not the first time the ILO has had to intervene in our domestic law structure, because it is because of the ILO that the penal sanctions were removed from the Masters and Servants Ordinance. It's because of pressure that they put on the government. It was not benevolence of anyone. To be clear on those things, combined with the struggles and efforts of workers. All right, let me say that last part, because I'm not sure that we understand that either. Combined with the efforts and struggles of workers. You can't sit down and expect somebody else to fix this for you. Right, and I said that in as much of a non-threatening way as I could. Yeah, okay. Right of organizations to organize their activities freely and to formulate their programs. In this previous comments, the committee had suggested that the government take measures to amend Section 59, 61, 65, 67, 69 concerning the majority required for a strike. So there are also concerns about the right to strike, which still do not exist fundamentally in Trinidad and Tobago, unless we're not sure about that. All right, see the comrades, you want to go and try and strike tomorrow, Eddie, just to see? We'll pass a hat now for your bail, you know. Yes, you test it just to see. All right, just to see. Yeah. So we're actually not allowed to strike, and we have to be clear on that. All right. So, comrades, I've come to the end of my little ramble there, but so some recommendations that I think we can take up. These are the sanitized recommendations. The real recommendations will be circulated privately after the session, right? So, one, I think that it is important that a review committee be established. And now I know we do have the IRRCB, right? But I think that in the same way that business sets up their own committees and they come to those spaces with common positions, the trade union movement needs to have its own IRA review committee and come to those spaces with common positions. 2 years ago, I did a session with PSI, and one of the workshops that we did was on reporting to international bodies, particularly UN bodies. We have a problem in the Caribbean where we don't like to write, where we don't like to read. We just don't pay attention to our business, period. All right? And then we go and we see somebody stands up in the parliament and they read a nice report from Standard & Poor's about the condition of the country or from some other international agency, and we get vexed and we cuss and we carry on. But the problem is that while we had an opportunity to contribute to the content of those reports, we didn't take advantage of those opportunities. So those opportunities exist for us to also add content to those reports. So comrades, I'm asking you and imploring you, the ILO has identified that there are some issues. The ILO has within its remit or spaces for the trade unions to also make submissions, reinforcing the concerns raised by the ILO. And I want to suggest that that be taken on seriously, that the trade union movement make the submissions to the ILO outlining its concerns about the Trade Union Act and the Industrial Relations Act. That is the second recommendation. And the third recommendation, comrades, is that I want to suggest that the Cipriani College be further engaged to assist the movement, not just with the IRA alone, but generally to come up with a trade union transformative policy for how we regulate labor relations in Trinidad and Tobago. And I can tell you that we are more than prepared to assist the movement in this regard, because laws start with policy. So the first thing we have to do is draft the policy on how we want this to change. I'm not saying that we don't go and take part in the consultations that the ministry is having. Of course not. But I'm saying that when we go to the consultations, we all go with a singular position that the trade union movement has already decided upon by itself. Absolutely critical. Because the business community is not going there as 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different entities with different positions. Their ideological position alone consolidates them. Yeah, their ideological grounding alone consolidates them. And therefore, they may not even need to meet, because they could be on opposite sides of the planet and will come to the same conclusion about what we should do about workers. Because ideologically, they're grounded in the same place. And there are a few additional things, but I think I will leave that for another time. And next week, you could probably talk to me outside the college under the flyover, waiting to see if I'll be let into the compound or not. Thank you very much for your time, comments.
Thank you very much, Akins. I guess I should have warned you that if you ask a historian to assess a problem, he will start with, in the beginning, God said. So, yeah, but Akins, as usual, as we continuously discuss, you can't understand a situation without understanding context. And in the Caribbean region, the context always goes back to colonialism. As Frantz Fanon pointed out a long time ago, and I just can't find any fault with his argument, if you create an institution that sole purpose is to perpetrate inequity, inequality, it is ever going to be that. It makes no difference who runs it. If you do not change the system will and can only do what it was intended to do. As Akins points out, the institutions that we run today were created during the days of colonialism, during the days of slavery and indentureship. They were created and operated with a particular intent. And we are yet to see those institutions change in nature. Why are we surprised when they continue to do the things that they were created to do? And is it not our call now to actually start to change these machines, to start to change their intent, to start to change their operating mechanics? One of the interesting things that Akins pointed out was the Combinations Acts that actually made trade unionism illegal. What's particularly interesting about that to me is that while those acts were repealed in England, our colonial masters, they were then implemented in the Caribbean, you know. So it was known to be wrong. And this is the question about content, context. This is the thing about intent that we have to understand. The thing was found to be wrong there, but workable here. And so I think Akins is inviting us to look at the legislation and go back to asking the question, what was the intent behind it? Because to change the legislation is to change the intent. And so with that, I'd like to invite any observations or questions from the floor concerning the discussion that we're having today. We have some people with mics in the floor. If you have a comment or question, you can raise your hand and we will get a mic to you. We have a question down in front here. If you can tell us who you are and what trade union or association you belong to.
So my name is Kamala Warner, and I really need to comment on what Mr. Vidale said, because if you don't understand where it started, you can't know where you're going. And if you look at everything that occurred from back then, that is from 1972 was one of the last times it was revised. And people who were rioting in that time and before no longer here. Because let's think of it. Everybody who born in 1972 is about 51 years today. And if you was 51 years today and you're born in that time, it means it didn't exist when that revolution took place. And what we need to understand is that if the young people are not part of what it is they are doing now, then we will not have any future. So everything that we do is going to affect our children. And if we don't change the minds of young people and make sure that they are part of the trade union movement, we have no trade union movement. The Industrial Stabilization Act only existed because of the amount of strikes. When we look at 1957 and the amount of strikes it had then, it was approximately 400. But when you look at 1960 to 1964, it increased it to over 74,000 people. And only because of that did the government abandon the laissez-faire intention and bring in the Industrial Stabilization Act to have control or regain social control on the workers. And if we don't pay attention to the history, we don't really go anywhere because we just continue to spill in a mud. When you look at May Day, what was the turnout? Comrade De Beek was there. How many people were actually present for May Day to say they actually came to walk for something and stand for something? What we're going to expect for Labor Day? We only have older people coming out because why? They understand how the trade union movement is here, why it's here, and where it have to go. But when you have no type of trade union movement going into the schools and putting that education in the mind from a young age to help them to understand when they come out, you have people going to UE and they're accepting the contracts in companies and they will never even think about walking into the doors of a trade union or even talking to a trade unionist because in fear of they losing their jobs. But why? That's because they don't understand the purpose and the intent of the trade unions and how important and the big role it could play in the organization that they work for. So everything that we do and everything that we intend to do must take into consideration how it started. And everything that they do have to have people who is young and who is still part of the companies to make these decisions, because most of the people who are on board come from a different era. And we in 2023, we no longer in the 1990s. I born in 1990. So I was only 32 years old. So I was nowhere around when none of them take place. And when I joined the trade union movement, I didn't even know nothing. When I joined the company that I work for, we had a union and I didn't even understand that. I just know we have a union and they're there for whatever issue we have. And it's an issue that occurred in the company that caused me to go and do a little more research. And in understanding and doing the research and know what the trade union come about, I was like, what? And I was not part of the union. I went and joined the union. And when I went and joined the union, I walked up to every terminal clerk like myself and spoke to them, not about now, but about the history from back then in the 1930s. And it's only in explaining the purpose of that and explaining what the Industrial Relations Act says about workers having the representation in industrial court when you have a bargaining unit, that they understand the intent and the purpose of being part of the trade union. And when I went with my form to the head office, I didn't go with just mine. I went with about 60 or 70 applications, and that gentleman there was the one who submitted all the applications. So my point is that everything that we do, you need to have different people from different eras involved, because you need those from back then because they are dinosaurs, but you also need those that come in because the institutional knowledge that they will have, you will not have it in the young ones. So everybody have their part to play, and every decision that we make, we need to take that into consideration. We really think that if we go and we form an industrial relation act committee, that the government going to listen to us? They are not, because why? They know they don't have the support of the citizens. When people looking at the unions on TV, what did I say? Them is a waste of time, because we only is lazy workers only fighting for more money. And if we don't change the minds of the average citizens and not just people who are in a union, we have no sort of victory coming out of this, because the government will see that they don't have the support of us. If we say we taking a day, all workers stay home, all workers going to work the next morning like nobody didn't just talk. And the government knows that, and they use that as a tool to do as they want and not pay attention to any letters that are submitted or anything that they want to stand for. So we, as if we call ourselves the trade union movement, the trade union simply means to be organized. And as he said, we can't go with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different heads. Organized means everybody becomes one. You can't go with a hand and then a foot separates, an elbow here, a chin here, is one head. And if we don't come up with a way to get into the average citizen's mind, then it makes no sense forming that committee, because we still don't have the support of the majority. And the only reason why we have what we have is because workers came out in a majority and stand for something they believed in, both Africans and East Indians, because that is what they used back then to ensure we had that segregation, so you don't have that labor organization. It's only when both come together is how we end up starting to see things going on. And these are things that we need to take into consideration. Look at the turnout here. What is this turnout? This is not looking good. And while it is a start, this is to show you that we have a lot of work to do as a trade union movement. Everybody who calls themselves a trade unionist needs to get off on the ground and find a way and come up with ways to infiltrate the average citizen. You don't need to be in a company that have a trade union to say, hey, I need to join a trade union. It's only when the government see we have that power will they take anything we have to say into consideration. And
Thank you
this
very
is
much,
something we
sister.
have to do.
Let's see, we have another comment on the side there.
Yeah. Name Neville Warner, former trade unionist. That's a
And
support.
dinosaur, don't forget dinosaur.
Huh?
And dinosaur.
Yeah. That's a support. There are two things I want in terms of supporting the young lady. One of the things that bothers me is that I don't know which trade union have that. There's no education program in trade unions anymore. So that workers don't have the knowledge and the historical thing. Because I was in a trade union where the leader closed down the education department for reasons claiming that all the oppositions to him was coming from that department. But basically, he was following the old tradition of his political leader then, that once you do educate a worker, you follow him.
Mhm.
And the other thing that I've been seeing in all the organizations that I get involved with is that when you have these so-called tripartite, because for me, it's not tripartite, I feel it's two organizations, workers and employers. So I don't get tired of this tripartite thing. One of the things that happens is that we go with very good plans when we meet the employers. You know the problem is? The people who the plans are for doesn't know the plans. So what happens is that when you have finished having that discussion, the government goes to parliament, pass a bill. To the average worker, they are of the view that what the government passed is in fact things agreed between the union and the government. Because we don't know information setting out, so let workers know exactly the things that we went to the government with. So that when the government brings the legislation, you can say to yourself that those are not what you went with, but what the government wants. So the government is usually a PR to say that they have consultation, but there's nothing whatsoever.
Thank you very much, comrades. I think that one of the more interesting things that Akins FC, we have a comment on the far side there. One of the more interesting things that Akins pointed out in his presentation was that we are looking at a discussion of procedures versus the rights of the worker. And what it came out in his comparative look at Trinidad and Tobago and some of the other Caribbean territories. We all underwent the colonial experience, but yet some of us came out on the side of convoluted procedures. Others came out on the side of statements of the rights of workers. So if we're going to change this situation, the question is, how do we change it in terms of the very nature of the legislation, the very content and intent of the legislation? We have a comment over there.
Hi. Good afternoon, Nikisha from NUGFW. So I just want to agree with the young lady in terms of educating the membership, by extension, the schools and so forth in terms of what trade unions. Oh God, I'm a bit cold, so I'm shaking a little bit. What is trade unionism, right? We had an exercise in April month on work, and I witnessed firsthand the employer trying to talk the workers out of joining the union rather than educate them as to what the union could do for them outside of having grievances. I think that we need, one of the things that I do when I meet the membership, well, our membership, is not just find out if they have an issue, educate them on what the union could do for them, how we can move forward in terms of making the workplace a better place, because we spend most of our time at work. We're not spending most of our times at home with children and whatnot, which we would like to do, but it is not happening. So we have to make it as comfortable and as inviting as possible, and not give the employer the leeway and the upper hand by not educating ourselves and educating the membership as to what our Bibles, the collective agreements and so forth entails. So you don't have to, in educating them, you would not have to have these issues where they would be able to stand up for themselves and even pass the knowledge on to others so that they are better equipped to know what they could do and cannot do, and the employer will have a harder time in terms of bullying the workers. And then they knowing these things, when it's time, for instance, we called a few times last year and year before for persons to come out and march on the red carpet, and the turnout was poor. And as if I am looking at it from a layman's point, the government, seeing that the unions calling out their membership, for instance, we are one of the largest union, and like 400 people for demonstration in terms of the cost items for the collective agreement is poor. We don't have the support because a lot of people do not know what the union really is there for. They just see it as, okay, when I get in trouble, the union go come and defend me. And I have to side with her on that side of things. Also, it is going to show for Labor Day, because May Day, I didn't even know about May Day outside, like before 4 years ago. I didn't know about Cipriani 4 years ago. I was passing here up and down. Knew nothing. We need to educate persons. We need to infiltrate these schools. That's just my little contribution.
Thank you very much, sister. I think there was someone around here asking for the mic.
Hello?
Trevor.
Yeah, hello.
Where? Oh. Yes, sir.
Yes, good afternoon. Peter Morris Siemens Union. Well, I could have a lot to say. I think there's a big disconnect between the trade union movement and communities of society on a whole. There's a big disconnect between the economic realities that society in terms of the workforce is facing and the labor movement. There's a big disconnect between the leadership of the labor movement and the membership in which they represent. And I will use a current scenario. Cipriani represents labor. It was really born out of labor. And we have a tripartite board, consists of labor. And look at Cipriani. There's a big disconnect with the representation we get at the level of the board of Cipriani from labor, reflective in the activities of Cipriani. There's a perfect example. The transition of the knowledge and the transition of society and culture does not reflect itself or echo itself in the corridors of labor. We have a large section of labor that sweats glue in the office with knowledge on every aspect of labor. I was a student of CTS College doing computer programming. At that time, I was writing programs for ATM machines and things through the computer codes. And I think I came up here and I bounced up Comrade Fredericks. Yeah. And I stopped a degree to do a certificate in labor. Because it got my interest, it got my attention. But coming into the labor movement, I was exposed to many different characters with capitalist interests and migraines that utilize the said machinery for wherever personal interests or interests that they have, disconnecting from the community. And I say the community because when we look at the period of successful labor movement, it was all under the umbrella of the communities as well. And when the legislation was drafted, it was drafted skillfully to remove the community representation and limit it to the workplace, that we say collective bargaining. And if we were at that time transitioning, we would have been able not to have that disconnect with society. Right? We should have not been able to allow that to start one at the workplace, because titles and the privileges come with titles make workers like myself with a title to the trade union movement forget they are workers. So when a member called me, I report to work. If it's a Saturday, Sunday, I make myself available because I volunteer to provide a service to a member who labor to pay my salary at the executive level because I'm no longer employed at the company that I work for a period of time. We hear the younger set of persons speak about the disconnection because there is no interest in the transition. There is no real key interest in losing something that I probably did not academically qualify for, but was able to acquire it through the labor movement. And if you look at some members of the labor movement from even on the ground floor, they say at the level of the floor, they are members like myself who are workers that carry titles. There's a substitute, branch chairman, committee members, executive members, who just love to be in front of a manager, a minister, and just love to show our faces. Trade union needs to assess and repurpose itself. And if we ought to understand what drives society, once we understand that, we would know that we had to become an economic power in order to get the movement. Because what has interested the worker in the 1930s, we already benefit from it. What workers want to hear is what other benefits as a collective we could acquire outside of the collective bargaining that we could economically benefit from. Cipriani offer a course called that thing with the credit unions and consumer affairs and all these things. I would have written Cipriani to start that process. I would have approached 2 other organizations, which is credit unions, with ideas come out of Cipriani. And when I did that, one particular credit union president wanted the idea, while one other was saying, in the next 10 years, you know what could happen? And we had people shut it down from the labor movement. Right? Unless younger people who understand the current culture, and unless trade unions could understand the needs that is common amongst the workers and society, members of society outside the workplace. The workforce by itself, if the same interests are persons in and outside of a bargaining body, which is the community and so on, interests are addressed, then we can get a movement. And the issue that affects persons is the individualism that the schools teach. They teach the individualism in qualifying, no longer collective. And one of the major problems current trade union has now is its credibility with those who represented by the highest level in front of the TV all the time. When you open up your TV, one set of comedians you're always seeing all the time. You won't see this young lady here. You won't see me. You won't see nobody else. When last you see a Daffy Duck on a cartoon station on Saturdays, that fade out. But we still seeing the comedians from 1980 something still in front of the TV. They are not connecting with the younger workforce. They're not identifying the economic and social problems within the communities that are affecting persons that they could hear and respond to a call. We pat ourselves on our back under Section 34, not understanding that the political party then were the force behind the movement for Section 34 under the labor movement. Because we are blindsided with our own economic interests. I will say that, and in closing, I will pass on with a pan. For these 2, them and whoever in front there, I can't get them more than $1. Because they are the only 2 since I'm in Cipriani here. I see. Let's really make the effort to give trade union the upper hand. And that could only be done if they connect with the younger members of the labor movement. Because I doubt it very much. At the head of labor, whether it's JTUM, whether it's NATO, whether it's Phyton, respect the efforts this institution put in the interest of labor. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Comrade. You can always tell a trade unionist when his closing comments are actually longer than his speech. Yeah. I just want to say, I think as usual, when you're in a trade union collective, you can see that we're very good at understanding all of the problems that we face. Because we've been living those problems for the last 30 years. And Peter said that we have to repurpose ourselves. We have to repurpose ourselves in the face of these challenges. And I think like that's the issue that we face tonight. But we can't solve all of the problems of all of the trade union movements, of all of the generations in one go. We have, however, a specific problem in front of us, a problem that actually affects almost everything else. If you can't recognize, then you don't have the strength that then turns into the numbers that then becomes the crowd on the street and all of that. So the question that I'm asking is, how do we change a 7-year process to make it a 7-day process? That's the challenge that we're facing. That's what we're discussing right now. Yeah. I think we have someone on the mic there.
Good evening, comrades. My name is Comrade Krista from the OWTU, student here at Cipriani. First, let me thank all those at Cipriani who would have come together to put on a session as this. The Industrial Relations Practice Diploma students would have done a lecture on recognition about 2 weeks ago. So we found it fitting, well, some of us would have found it fitting to be here to really benefit from the information that would have been given. Now, my concern when we say that young people, I still consider myself a young person. When we say that young people are not interested, the email came to me, and I'm sure it came to all the students, but who chose to be here. So we can't always say that young people are not invited or they are not encouraged to be a part of these sessions or a part of education, because it's put out there, but are we really showing an interest? So I'll just start with that. I want to endorse also some of the comments by all the speakers who came before me. Comrade Vidale, you would have hinted at something several times in your presentation. And I want to ask, why are employers united? That. Why is it that they seem to have protection from the state? Because we saw that trade union activities in the past would have been seen as a threat to national security. And if trade union activities were seen as a threat to national security, somebody would have had to be protecting the interest of the employer. Why is that? Why is it that the interest of the employer needs to be protected? Why is it that unions are being frustrated? Why is this process that is taking place being made to frustrate unions? Comrades, it's about interest. It's about interest of the employer. It's about interest of capital. And I'm going to endorse one of the things the comrade said about education. And I think in educating, we need to move a step further from just saying that the employers are being protected, the employers are united, and really explain to communities, explain to workers why that is. Employers are not going to encourage you to join the union because it goes against their interest. Their interest is capital. So they are not going to encourage you to join a union where you will most likely take a position to stand against something that they are doing that's going to help them to bring in profit and to reduce your collective bargaining power. They're not going to, most are not going to do that. Sometimes I feel as well that trade unions, some trade unions, and also progressive organizations do not recognize or do not appreciate the unity of the employer class and the unity of capital. And if we do what we are doing and playing it as business as usual, then we are always going to be at the back end trying to catch up. And it's going to come to a time where we are going to, what happened here? So I think that we definitely, I take the recommendation from the comrade, the Industrial Relations Act Committee, that's what it is. I believe it's necessary. And I'm going to also say that I believe there needs to be some contribution from the youth, contribution from community as well, because we need to also combine all those interests so that we could really put forward something where people, general, feel that trade unionism or trade union activities is in line with their interests. Because if people don't feel like it's connected to them, then what we really doing? All right, comrades, so this is my small contribution.
Thank you very much, sister. In relation to recognition, I'd just like to acknowledge the presence of Comrade Michael Anisette of NATOC and SWWTU CCL at the back of the room. Thank you for being with us, Comrade. I see we have someone else on the mic there.
Good afternoon, comrades. Joel from Amalgamated Trade Union. I hear what people are saying about the education and the youth, right? I want to touch on something first and foremost. I didn't think I would be here today because I was employed under a company. And when there was laying off workers, we went to a union. We pay our dues, we explain them what it is, what's going on. We get our throats bust. Up to now, nobody having a phone call or nothing. They take our dues. So what I'm saying is to each and everyone inside of here, we have a job to do to protect the workers. So sometimes the disconnect is not really the education, you know, it's about the passion and the fight. Now I came into this organization and I saw what was taking place, and I take the oath of stepping into the trade union industry, right? So sometimes it's really not the education, it's about the passion and the fight for the workers, because some workers in different organizations is suffering. And what we are doing as unionists, just sitting down sometimes and just not taking it on. So sometimes we have to make this step and step up to the plateau and really help our comrades, because our people outside is really, really under some stress. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. And the comrade is right. It is about the passion for the fight, but at some point in time, the fight becomes how we are fighting. And again, we are facing a very real issue here, a very real issue of that will determine the ability to join a union, that will determine the strength of the union. And there's a stranglehold on that crucial moment, that recognition moment. And again, we're looking at how do we change this situation that we find ourselves in. I don't know if we have any comments from the stage. Well, if you could keep yourself to 30 seconds, that'd be amazing. Well, go ahead.
Thanks. I do. By giving a concrete example, Ozzy talks about time. Let me preempt what I'm saying. I'm not a climate change denier. Let me say that first. All right. However, and this is from yesterday in the session. So I have one person who starts to talk about what is driving transition. And they start to talk about market forces and so on, driving transition and all that. And this is endorsed around the room. And then they start to talk about some of the things that are happening to lead to the transition. So by October, the European Union is going to have carbon emission taxes on goods coming into Europe. So we have to learn how to report on carbon emissions. What does it mean when we say market forces? It's supply and demand. It means that the supply for something is so great that it forces us to go in a particular direction. All of the data to today shows that the use of coal is increasing, use of oil is increasing, use of gas is increasing. Renewable energy accounts for less than 5% of global production or global energy use. Less than 5, it is 4 point something. And it has been there for a while. There's no significant change. We have a global movement now that is saying to workers, brace yourself for job loss, brace yourself for changes in job, driven by market forces, supply and demand, where the supply and demand suggests that there is no change in supply and demand. but we're introducing new taxes. We're telling workers, brace yourself for losing your jobs. We're telling them, brace yourself for higher prices. Brace yourself to now go into new areas of technology. Right? I mean, one of the points I was raised yesterday that was so obvious, and I was like, yeah, so you all know that? You know that none of our roofs are designed to actually hold a solar panel, right? And when you go and put that 300-pound solar panel on your roof and you're sleeping under there, you have to consider, you know, just don't put it over your bed. That's all I'm going to say to you. Right? Just don't put the panel over your bed. Our roofs are not designed for that. And this is something that came out in the conversation yesterday. And I was like, yeah, but solar panels didn't invent yesterday. We know that a long time. So, what, and this is the point. Davos is a real place. The WTO is a real organization. Yeah? And if we don't understand these things, WTO currently is negotiating, is discussing a series of pieces of changes in policy that will affect us as small island developing states. And none of these conversations are happening at a governmental level, at a national level. We're not having any of these conversations as a country. They're talking about digitization and they're talking about cross-border, how do you move information from one space to another? So all our information is flowing out, making people rich in the US, making people rich in the European Union, and we are getting nothing out of that data that is flowing out. And the thing is, because of the same WTO that has restrictions for countries like us to say, no, well, you can't, you have to liberalize. You can't introduce non-trade barriers and so on. So we can't introduce something that's going to make it difficult for Facebook to be in Trinidad, for Netflix to be in Trinidad, unless they get taxed. We can't do that, right? But the European Union could pass a bill that's going to say to our companies in the Caribbean that unless you are counting your carbon emissions, you will pay a higher tax to go into the European Union and everybody else. So they are guided, not by any abstraction. This is not fairy tale. These are real boardroom, and that's why I said it is boardroom. These are real boardroom discussions that they all pay attention to, right? Yesterday, the ESG, there's an ESG conversation, right? Environment, social, and governance. It's not developed in Trinidad and Tobago. That is an international thing. They are part of an international movement. They are part of an international discussion. And you know what we're doing? Still bickering about who don't like who. We ain't serious, you know, not even a little bit. We're not even serious a little bit. And I try, and there are times when I feel like, you know what? Go down on the road, partner. When employers lick up the movement, then all you realize how much foolishness we on. But, however, I had to live here too. All right? I have family who need trade union representation, so I cannot take that position. As frustrated as I am, as stressed as I am, as disappointed as I am in some persons, sometimes I understand fundamentally what the purpose of this organization is, and that is the driver. What is the purpose? The purpose, and in the same way when you talk about the individual, if you still believe that one individual or two individuals could determine what the trade union movement is, then I say to you, I don't know what the trade union movement is about. Full stop. The movement will exist regardless of person X, Y, or Z, because it exists because exploitation of workers exists. Full stop. Whatever form it takes has nothing to do with a dinosaur, a young person, or whatever. The fact is, the exploitation is there, comrades. Either we deal with it or it will deal with us. It is as simple as that. Yeah? So, we're not serious, the business people are. And that is why they're more organized than us. Simple as that. Right? Because at the end of the day, when they lose their money. Their concern is about their money. So I'm happy that they have a passion. I'm happy that they care about something. I want us to start to care about something too. And that is the problem.
Thank you very much, Akins. That's the longest 30 seconds of my life. But a good point came up in Akins's, well, what do you call that, a tirade? Things are changing. Things are changing. And one of the most important things that is changing is the very nature of work today. The workplace is changing. The people at work are changing. How they work is changing. There's no workplace. People are working from home. You have, what I suspect is a youth unemployment rate of more than 25%. You know, you have a lot of young people going into small business, nano entrepreneurship. What's the role of the trade union? How do we represent these people? And if we have difficulty representing in the context of the old factory model, where everybody in one place, if we cannot get recognized where 2,000 people working in one place, how are we going to be recognized in representing people who spread all over the place and have no single workplace? You know, this is the issue. At some point, it comes down to process and procedures. I think I saw Brian with the mic there. Brace yourself. Brian is Akins squared. Okay.
Yeah, good this afternoon. The point that is being taken up here is this issue of recognition. And I think it is, I mean, every forum you go on, people lament education among the youth, the drivers to bring members on board and all of things, and recruiting membership in industries and all of that. We know we have a problem with that. We know we perennially have a problem. My first encounter in the trade union, when I was invited to attend an election, an organization that had over 850 people, there were 8 people there. When I expressed my disappointment, the chairman looked at me and said, for election, that's a good crowd. You know, so I don't get dejected when I see these numbers. As a matter of fact, I am happy to see so many people here this afternoon, right? But I think we should keep focus on what we are here for. And before us is a very serious issue, the issue of recognition, right? We can deal with all those other issues. They will remain with us. They're like the poor, they will remain with us for the rest of our lives, right? So let us deal with what we came for here. I know you tried to take us back to that point a while ago. We seem to have gone off again. And I think we really need to address it because it is important, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade. And I just want to underscore a point that Brian just made. This is not a start. I look inside here, I'm seeing presidents of trade unions. I'm seeing general secretaries of trade unions. I see a man from Grenada who in charge of a Caribbean-wide body of trade unions. I see technocrats from the ILO. I see activists. I see dinosaurs. I see some people who pass dinosaur. You know, I'm recognizing at least 10 trade unions inside here. This is not a start. This is a power move. So Brian is right. We need to take some of the light inside here and shine it on the problem. We have people who have dealt with this problem, who have been fighting this problem for longer than I've been alive, and I've been alive a long time. It's kind of surprising Mario still is, but here he is, dinosaur. So let's believe, well, exactly. This is a power move. To look at a particular problem, let us use the power in this room, in this virtual room, to address the problem. And as Brian said, we go take on everything else in due time. We have a comment over. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I didn't realize you have the mic. And my apologies. So my name is Julie Bisessa Pantin. I am represented PSA. I am the chairman of my section. Back to the point that was being made, how do we change a 7-year process? And while listening, 3 of the things came back to me, which is the recognition as a human right violation. So we could, I think, look at that. The Constitution, our Constitution, which is because it's a violation of our Constitution, and the ILO conventions. Now, during COVID, the ILO made it a point to ask employees and employers to work together. And then they came up with all these different laws and regulations. So if they could have come up with all this for this period, I think we should have a stronger, how to put it, a stronger, I'll help me out now. Yes, thanks, that. For put forward in our views, because at the end of the day, what this quote unquote reset was about is making the gap wider from the haves and the haves not. And somebody said, don't let a crisis go to race. And we are in crisis mode right now, and we need to get the laws changed under human rights violations, because it's getting worse. And that is my contribution. So I think that could be our starting point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sister. We're kind of running long on time, and we still have one more person to address the gathering. So I'd like to, I'm sorry to cut off the question section, but I'd like to invite Comrade Andre Lewis to the stage to bring us solidarity greetings from the CCL, the Caribbean Congress of Labor.
Okay, good night, comrades. And my task and duty will be short to bring solidarity from the Caribbean Congress of Labor. But I wish to congratulate the Cipriani College, and in particular, Elma Francois, and the movement in Trinidad for putting on this timely discussion. The fact that the Court of Appeal judgment came out in December, and on the 4th of May, you have this local and regional engagement to address this matter speaks volume. And it begs into question, or it highlights the aspect of the need to collectively approach these issues. The period has changed, and it didn't happen overnight. The employer class, or the ideological outlook right now, is so set in such a way to take away the rights and benefits of workers. This is a social issue, social justice issue. And more the courts have been used because our pockets are not deep. The employer class understands that they can tie up things in the court for years and years and years, and it leads to frustration. And this is not happening in isolation. In Grenada, in March of 2022, last year, the Technical and Allied Workers Union took a matter up to the level of the Privy Council, a matter that touches and concerns on the aspect of the right of workers in a trade dispute to be heard in the court. And I can tell you, we did not speak to anyone who were not confident that the Privy Council would have reversed the decision of the High Court and Court of Appeal, that in terms of what you call even natural justice, that the court, as many said, is a bastion, a final bastion of justice, would not be denied as an access to address issues. Privy Council ruled that in keeping with the legislation in Grenada, that it did not allow for these matters to be heard in the court. And with all the due respect to the courts, we are dealing with human beings. Many times it depends on who sits in a particular hearing based on the ideological outlook. Yes, and therefore it is important for what Cipriani is doing to be able to produce colleagues and comrades who can get involved in all the different arms of the state. It's important to do that. And I can't help but recognizing Comrade Mario, I must call you out, Comrade, for the contributions that you and others have made to the labor movement in Trinidad and the region. And there are two aspects I want to, my thing is short, but because Comrade Akins have highlighted two issues out of Grenada, it is not in isolation. The Grenada Constitution, which speaks about the right to join a trade union of your choice. If you go back to the history of Grenada, the 1951 revolution with Eric Gary, who a young trade unionist who got, who attacked the plantation class in order to bring benefits to laborers, and who was the prime minister in 1973, going into independence in 1974, saw it fit to ensure that the trade union right to join a trade union was enshrined in the Constitution. So despite the challenges that one had with Gary in latter years, he must be recognized for this. And then, although it was guaranteed in the Constitution, it did not say that an employer had to recognize the trade union, because there's a difference between the right of joining a trade union, they made that distinction, and the right of an employer to engage. But life is about progress. So by 1979, the Grenada Revolution, the Trade Union Recognition Act gave force to ensuring that once you became a member of a trade union, the employer had to recognize your need. And I'm saying this to say that yes, we're in a different period, but we are not in a different period. Why am I saying this? Let us not forget the importance of the politics. And therefore we ought to engage the political parties. We ought to engage civil society. And I strongly believe in the tripartite arrangement, comrades. This particular period is extremely important. So one of the ways of dealing with this, Cipriani and Elma Francois and the trade union movement is on the right path, but it is also important for us to call on our political representatives to ensure that they understand the importance of these changes to be made, because these are human rights. So, comrades, I wish to thank Cipriani. Thank you for your turning out here. Right? This is one region. Caribbean Congress of Labor is committed to working along to ensure that whatever is needed to be done is done by bringing awareness to the region so that these changes can be made legislatively. Because these decisions are made in Parliament. Obviously, pressures have to be brought. Pressures have to come from on the ground. But we have to be able to influence the legislators so that these things can be brought to Parliament and then they can become laws. So, comrades, I really want to once again thank you very much and to recognize that this struggle is not just for Trinidad. The struggle is not just for Trinidad, because the employer class, the bourgeoisie, let's call them for they are. I know there are certain languages that people doesn't like to hear again, right? But we can't move away from that, right? The bourgeoisie class will be paying attention to this judgment, and they will try to replicate it throughout the region. So your fight here is not just for you, and therefore it is our duty, it is my duty as part of the Caribbean movement to leave Grenada to come here directly, right? To bring solidarity greetings to you. The virtual is important, but nothing beats back that physical togetherness. Actual solidarity is to be able to bounce and touch your hand. And that is what they are trying to prevent. So let's make use of the virtual is important. But solidarity calls for that physical presence. So, comrade, once again, all the very best. Take care.
Long live the labor movement.
Forward ever. Forward ever. Thank you very much, comrades.
Very much, Comrade Lewis. And now, as the last act of tonight's play, I want to invite Comrade Ozzy Warwick to stage, not to give a vote of thanks, but to summarize what we've been talking about and to give an indication of how we see moving forward from this start.
I want to first start by actually recognizing every single comrade and soldier who here this evening. I don't want to take it for granted. And I want to recognize all those who joined us online. We had almost 80 people online. And because I know that online we will have agents of the state and agents of the employer class, the bourgeoisie, I will not engage in self-flagellation. I'm not doing that. No. I want to send a message as a summary of this evening to the agents of the state and the agents of the employer class. And the first message I want to send to them is that regardless of our differences, you see on this issue of recognition, the trade union movement is united on this issue. And the second message I want to send to them, because they're paying attention, is that the trade union movement united around making this issue a priority issue. Comrades agree? Comrades all agree? You have to start taking these steps and take the fight to them. The third thing, the third message we want to send to them is that coming out of this evening, we are very clear that this issue of recognition is about power. It is about power. Power of capital versus the power of labor. And we in the trade union movement want to tell them that we intend to build union power. And the final thing, because I said I'll be short, I like to live up to my promises. The final thing is that we want to tell them we're coming for them. And here how? Coming for you. And don't send agents to try to distract us and divide us. We're coming for you. And here how? We intend to lodge a formal complaint to the International Labour Organization about the violation of the citizens and workers' rights in this country with regards to that piece of legislation and that recognition process. We're taking the fight to them. And that is what I want to say here this evening. Thank you, comrade.
Well, that's one way to end it. And I think it's obvious that given the situation that we're in, given the fact that 2,000 workers just got denied their rights of representation just like that, out of the blue, there is no choice but to take this situation seriously. There is no choice but to look at every avenue available to say just how serious this matter is. There is no choice but to represent that we need a change in this vital process of recognition so that we can grow our membership, so that we can become the movement that so many of you young people want us to be, so that the old dinosaurs can go away quietly and let you guys roar and rule the place. So thank you very much, Ozzy, for your comments. That essentially brings us to the end of tonight's activities. As Comrade Ozzy said, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight in person. I know it's difficult. We're coming out of COVID and we're not exactly sure how to be in public anymore. I want to thank everybody who from across the region who was out there online. Virtual is now part of our reality and hybrid will be here forever. So thank you very much for being here, for signaling just how important this issue is. And let us keep going until we get real effective change in this vital process, this process of recognition. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. Please get home safely.